By the final winter of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Cities lay in ruins, skies once ruled by the Luftwaffe now dominated by the relentless formations of American bombers. Amid the fading roar of an empire's last breath, a German pilot named Hans Werner Lerche faced a decision that would determine not only his survival, but the future of post-war aviation. Lerche was not a fighter ace or frontline hero. He was a test pilot, one of the most skilled in the Luftwaffe. Educated as an aeronautical engineer, he spent the war inside the secret hangars of the German Air Ministry, evaluating every aircraft Germany could produce. He had flown the Bf-109, the Fw-190, and the revolutionary Me-262 jet. His reports were methodical, clinical, and precise. Yet as the war dragged into its final months, his conclusions grew darker. He knew that the Luftwaffe's best machines, though advanced, were outmatched by the sheer reliability and production power of American industry. In late November 1944, Lerche was assigned to evaluate a captured American fighter, a P-51 Mustang that German engineers had repaired for testing. When he flew it, he immediately recognized its superiority. It climbed faster, flew farther, and responded more smoothly than any German design. He returned from that test flight with quiet dread. The war was no longer a contest of bravery or tactics. It was a battle of technology, efficiency, and scale, and Germany had lost all three. Each day, Allied bombers darkened the skies over the Reich. The factories that once produced engines and wings now lay in ashes. Pilots flew missions on dwindling fuel supplies. The Me-262 jets, marvels of engineering, stood idle for lack of spare parts. Lerche watched as the test fields emptied, as his fellow engineers spoke of miracles that would never come. What had begun as a career of scientific curiosity had turned into participation in a dying empire's final delusions. As the front collapsed, Lerche began to plan an escape. He knew the Soviets were advancing from the east, and their treatment of captured Luftwaffe personnel was brutal. He also knew that the Americans valued intelligence, especially technical knowledge. To survive, he needed to reach them not as a prisoner, but as a resource. His opportunity came in December 1944, when he filed an ordinary test flight plan from Richlin Airfield. He took off in the repaired P-51 under the guise of a routine performance check. Instead of circling back, he pointed his aircraft west and kept flying. Below him stretched the frozen landscape of a collapsing nation. Villages burned, roads were choked with retreating soldiers, and columns of smoke marked every horizon. Lerche crossed the Rhine River at low altitude, gliding just above treetop level to avoid radar. He carried no weapons, only his flight log and technical notes. When he spotted a small Allied airfield near the Belgian border, he lowered his landing gear and brought the Mustang down on a rough strip of dirt and snow. American soldiers surrounded the aircraft, expecting a trap. What they found instead was a German officer who stepped calmly from the cockpit and surrendered without resistance. He identified himself by name and profession. He said he was a test pilot, not a combatant, and that he came bearing knowledge rather than hostility. The soldiers took him into custody, uncertain whether they had captured a spy, a deserter, or something in between. For days, Lerche was interrogated by American intelligence officers. They asked why he had defected, how he had stolen the plane, and what information he carried. He spoke with calm precision, explaining in fluent English that the Luftwaffe's technical advantage was a myth. He described the weaknesses of German engines, the failures of its fuel systems, and the inefficiency of its production. He offered detailed assessments of both German and Allied aircraft, and to the astonishment of his captors, his data was accurate and verifiable. The officers sent his reports up the chain of command. What they read impressed them. The defector's knowledge was extensive, his technical vocabulary fluent, and his insight valuable. He was not a fanatic seeking refuge, but a scientist seeking purpose. Against expectation, the U.S. Army Air Forces decided to test his claim. Instead of locking him away, they brought him to a controlled airfield in southern France and allowed him to continue his work under supervision. For Lerche, captivity became collaboration. The Americans provided him with access to several aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and even the same P-51 Mustang he had used to defect. Guards were always present, and every flight was documented. Yet within those boundaries, he was free to do what he did best: observe, measure, and understand. He recorded his findings meticulously, noting that American aircraft were designed for practicality, not perfection. They were easier to maintain, more forgiving in flight, and built for the realities of war rather than theoretical performance. His observations confirmed what American engineers already suspected but could not yet articulate. German engineering pursued complexity, American design pursued endurance. One sought elegance, the other sought victory. Lerche's reports began to circulate among U.S. technical units, translated and distributed to researchers who would later become part of America's post-war aviation boom. He soon encountered the P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational American jet fighter. Though he was not permitted to fly it, he observed every detail of its design. He noted its clean aerodynamic shape, the absence of propellers, and the thunderous sound of its turbojet engine. In that moment, Lerche understood that the age of piston-driven warfare was over. The future would belong to jet propulsion, and whichever nation mastered it first would dominate the next generation of flight. His technical assessments grew increasingly forward-looking. He spoke less about the current war and more about what would come after. To the Americans, this made him invaluable. To his former comrades, had they known, it would have marked him a traitor. Yet for Lerche, the choice was neither betrayal nor ideology. It was survival through science. He had witnessed firsthand how Germany's obsession with prototypes and political interference destroyed its potential. In his mind, aligning with the Americans was not submission to the enemy, but preservation of the craft he had devoted his life to mastering. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, Lerche's cooperation deepened. He was moved from one test base to another, eventually accompanying U.S. technical teams into the heart of the defeated Reich. There, amid the ruins of aircraft factories and research centers, he guided American officers through piles of wreckage and abandoned blueprints. He identified which projects had genuine promise and which were fantasy. He explained the theoretical principles behind jet propulsion, swept-wing design, and rocket-assisted takeoff. His understanding helped bridge the gap between captured data and practical application. By the summer of 1945, with the war over, Lerche was no longer treated as a prisoner. He remained under custody, but his daily life resembled that of an engineer in an international research mission. He was consulted on test reports, asked to translate technical notes, and occasionally brought into discussions about future jet development. American officers began to see him less as a German and more as a specialist whose expertise transcended national boundaries. His calm demeanor, precise language, and methodical explanations earned him quiet respect among those who worked with him. When Allied intelligence began consolidating German scientific knowledge under a classified program, Lerche's name appeared frequently in internal reports. His notes were included among the documents that shaped what would soon be called Operation Paperclip, the covert effort to recruit German scientists and engineers for American research after the war. While Lerche's exact role remained ambiguous, his influence was clear. His analyses helped identify which captured technologies were worth studying and which were impractical relics of Nazi ambition. In a sense, his defection had turned him into an early contributor to the very program that would redefine global aeronautics. The months following Germany's surrender were disorienting for him. The nation he had served no longer existed. The institutions he had worked for were dismantled or absorbed by the victors. Yet he found purpose in the continuation of his work. He contributed to the cataloging of German designs, explaining their strengths and limitations with unflinching honesty. In private notes later recovered from archives, he admitted feeling both guilt and relief: guilt for having abandoned his comrades, relief for having escaped the insanity of Hitler's final months. He described the contrast between the collapsing Luftwaffe and the efficient organization of American test programs. In Germany, resources had been squandered on competing designs, ideological projects, and unrealistic timetables. In America, each aircraft evolved through structured experimentation and incremental improvement. To Lerche, it was as though two civilizations had approached flight from opposite philosophies, one seeking the ideal form, the other seeking the effective machine. As the United States gathered the fragments of Germany's scientific legacy, Lerche's insights gained new significance. His reports influenced early U.S. studies of captured Me-262 jets and guided adjustments in maintenance protocols for jet engines. Some of his evaluations appeared anonymously in technical bulletins distributed to research centers in Wright Field, Ohio, and Langley, Virginia. They emphasized the importance of reliability over theoretical performance and warned against the German habit of chasing perfection at the expense of practicality. Those lessons would echo through the early years of the American jet age. By late 1945, Lerche's collaboration with the Americans was effectively complete. The war was over, and the new struggle, a silent competition for technology between former allies, had already begun. The Soviet Union was seizing German scientists from the East, mirroring the American effort in the West. Each side sought to build the next generation of weapons and aircraft, using the knowledge of those who had once served Hitler's regime. Lerche, though not a public figure in this shadow war, represented a quieter kind of transition, the transformation of knowledge from one world to another. His defection, once seen as an act of desperation, had become a template for scientific surrender. Instead of dying in a lost cause, he had turned his expertise into currency, exchanging it for survival and a place in history's technical margins. When declassified decades later, American intelligence files confirmed that his crash landing had not been accidental but deliberately planned. His decision to cross the lines had been his own, conceived not as betrayal but as an experiment, a test of whether understanding could outlive ideology. In the years that followed, many of the aircraft Lerche had evaluated evolved into the foundation of the U.S. Air Force's post-war arsenal. The lessons he helped articulate, simplicity, reliability, adaptability, became guiding principles for modern aviation. His name, though largely forgotten outside specialist circles, lived on in the margins of technical reports, in the quiet acknowledgments of engineers who studied his data long after the guns of Europe had fallen silent. Hans Werner Lerche's journey from Luftwaffe test pilot to contributor to America's aviation research symbolized the strange transformation of knowledge born from conflict. His story revealed how the boundaries between enemies blurred when science became the common language. The machines he once tested for a collapsing empire helped launch the technologies of a rising one. In a war that consumed millions of lives, his defection was a single, silent act of preservation, of information, of skill, and perhaps of conscience. By the time the war's dust settled, the world of flight had changed forever. Jet propulsion had replaced propellers, and the future of warfare would now be measured in speed and altitude rather than numbers and ranks. Somewhere in that transition, between the ruin of one nation and the ascent of another, stood a man who had chosen knowledge over loyalty. He had crossed a line drawn not on maps, but in the air, the thin space where survival meets understanding, and where the sky, indifferent to flags and ideologies, continues to open before those who dare to fly. The interrogation began within hours of Lerche's arrival at the Allied airfield. Intelligence officers from the U.S. Army Air Forces questioned him about every aspect of Luftwaffe aircraft, tactics, and logistics. To their surprise, Lerche spoke fluent English and maintained a calm, precise tone. He described not only the technical aspects of German aircraft, but also the conditions within the Luftwaffe, shortages of fuel, the loss of veteran pilots, and the growing dominance of Allied air power. American officers, recognizing his deep expertise, soon realized that Lerche was far more valuable as a collaborator than as a prisoner. Instead of being confined, Lerche was transferred to a secure testing facility where captured German and Allied aircraft were being evaluated. Engineers and test pilots gathered around him as he explained aerodynamic differences between German and American fighters. His understanding of aircraft behavior under extreme conditions fascinated U.S. personnel. They were particularly impressed by his knowledge of engine performance, high-altitude maneuverability, and aerodynamic stability. After days of debriefing, Lerche received an unusual proposal. He would assist in testing American aircraft, providing comparative insights from his years flying the latest German models. The suggestion defied military convention, placing a former enemy pilot at the controls of advanced U.S. fighters, but the need for accurate assessments outweighed the risks. Lerche accepted the offer, fully aware that his cooperation might determine his fate after the war. Under supervision, he began flying the P-47 Thunderbolt, analyzing its robust construction and heavy armament. He noted its durability compared to the lightweight German designs and commented on its ability to absorb punishment without losing stability. He flew the P-38 Lightning next, examining the twin-engine configuration and the way it maintained control even during asymmetric thrust. The American pilots listened attentively as Lerche discussed the plane's advantages over the Luftwaffe's twin-engine fighters. His most detailed evaluation came with the P-51 Mustang, a machine that had become the terror of the German skies. Lerche described how the aircraft's laminar flow wing gave it speed and range beyond anything Germany could field at that stage of the war. He emphasized how the Mustang's reliability and fuel efficiency made it possible for Allied pilots to escort bombers deep into German territory, something the Luftwaffe could no longer counter. These insights confirmed what Allied strategists already suspected. The technical balance of air power had shifted irreversibly. When he was introduced to the early jet prototype, the P-80 Shooting Star, Lerche was visibly intrigued. He had test-flown the German Me-262 and He-162, both products of desperate late-war innovation. Comparing them, he described the American jet as stable and well-engineered, less prone to engine failure and aerodynamic stalls. The Americans carefully recorded every observation he made. His analysis became an invaluable reference for the growing U.S. jet program, which was still in its infancy. As weeks turned into months, Lerche's role expanded beyond test flights. He assisted in compiling technical reports, explaining German design philosophy, and evaluating captured Luftwaffe planes against their Allied counterparts. U.S. engineers were astonished at the depth of his understanding. He explained how German aircraft production had been crippled by resource shortages, bombing raids, and internal rivalry between aircraft manufacturers. His accounts painted a vivid picture of a military machine collapsing under its own complexity. Though he wore no uniform, Lerche lived under constant watch. His every movement was observed, every conversation recorded. Yet, unlike a typical prisoner, he was treated with respect, given access to technical materials, and occasionally invited to observe classified projects. American officers regarded him as a bridge to understanding Germany's once formidable aviation industry. In time, Lerche revealed the truth behind his arrival. His crash landing had not been the result of engine trouble or navigation error, it had been deliberate. He had grown disillusioned with the Nazi regime and saw no future in its final, desperate months. The destruction of German cities, the loss of comrades, and the futility of continued resistance convinced him that the war was lost. His defection was planned with precision, coordinated through neutral intermediaries, though the full details remained known only to a few within Allied intelligence. After the war ended, Lerche's cooperation was quietly acknowledged in U.S. records. Though he never became a public figure, his technical contributions shaped American understanding of German aircraft and influenced future aviation programs. His reports on jet design, material fatigue, and engine stress factors found their way into early Cold War research documents. Some of his data was later referenced in studies connected to Operation Paperclip, the secret program that brought German scientists and engineers to work in the United States. While many of those scientists became well-known figures in the post-war era, Lerche remained obscure. His defection had been too sensitive to publicize, his work too closely tied to wartime intelligence. Yet within the small world of military aviation experts, his name carried quiet respect. Engineers who read his evaluations noted his objectivity, his clarity of thought, and his ability to explain complex aerodynamic phenomena in simple, precise language. Over time, declassified documents revealed fragments of his story. They showed the reports he wrote, filled with annotations comparing the Me-262's weaknesses to the P-80's potential, or analyzing why the P-51's radiator design allowed it to outperform faster German aircraft. They included his assessments of flight stability under battle conditions and his notes on the psychological state of German pilots in the war's final months. His work demonstrated how technological superiority alone could not win a war without strategy, logistics, and morale. He often emphasized that the Luftwaffe's downfall was not purely mechanical. It was the product of exhaustion, resource scarcity, and leadership that refused to confront reality. The Americans who read his words saw in them the testimony of a man who had witnessed the collapse of a nation from within the cockpit. Years later, as classified files began to be declassified, historians would piece together the magnitude of his involvement. They found detailed reports signed with his initials, data tables comparing wing stress tolerances, and handwritten notes analyzing pilot workload. His technical papers often ended with pragmatic conclusions, recommendations for improved air intake systems, or observations about the balance between fuel economy and thrust output. These writings revealed a man devoted to precision, unburdened by rhetoric. His words reflected the discipline of a test pilot who had survived by understanding machines better than anyone else. In every paragraph, there was an implicit contrast between the chaos of war and the order of engineering. Lerche's perspective also shed light on a larger truth, that the transfer of knowledge between enemies had become one of the defining features of the post-war world. His collaboration represented a microcosm of the global shift from conflict to competition, from destruction to technological rivalry. Though he never appeared in headlines or public ceremonies, his fingerprints were embedded in the early Cold War's aviation breakthroughs. The flight stability data he supplied influenced not only the refinement of the P-80, but also the experimental research leading to supersonic aircraft. The careful measurements he provided helped American engineers avoid errors that had doomed several German prototypes. By the late 1940s, as the jet age accelerated, Lerche's direct role diminished. Younger engineers, trained in universities and research centers, began to dominate the field. His work, however, remained foundational. Declassified later, his reports were cited in academic papers on early jet performance and stability margins. They were, in essence, the bridge between wartime experience and peacetime innovation. When the Air Force archived its technical reports from the 1940s, many of Lerche's contributions were preserved anonymously. Yet among aviation historians, his story persisted, an account of how a single act of defection transformed into a quiet partnership that advanced both science and strategy. In the years immediately following 1947, as the United States transitioned fully into its post-war identity, and the Cold War began to define military priorities, Hans Werner Lerche's presence within American aviation circles faded from view but not from influence. The formal establishment of the U.S. Air Force, the reorganization of research facilities, and the onset of secrecy surrounding new technologies meant that his name rarely appeared on any official documents. Yet within laboratories, engineering meetings, and technical briefings, fragments of his insight continued to shape the work being done. The scientists who joined under Operation Paperclip arrived with fanfare among insiders, but were kept invisible to the public. They included experts from Peenemünde, Göttingen, and Munich, men who had worked on rocket propulsion, radar, and high-speed aerodynamics. Many were surprised to find that reports written years earlier already contained summaries of German technology so detailed they could only have come from someone deeply embedded in the Luftwaffe's test community. That individual, though unnamed in the archives they were shown, was Lerche. His debriefings, now classified under technical intelligence files, had provided the Americans with a map of Germany's aviation knowledge before most of the scientists had even arrived. He had explained how projects were organized, where innovation was concentrated, and which engineers had been responsible for critical breakthroughs. As a result, the U.S. was able to identify key specialists more efficiently than any other Allied power. Without public acknowledgement, Lerche's early cooperation had indirectly shaped the scope and success of Operation Paperclip. While the German scientists were relocated to bases in Texas, Ohio, and California, Lerche remained in a quiet administrative capacity, reviewing translated documents and annotating reports from the incoming teams. He corrected technical misunderstandings and highlighted nuances that non-German readers might overlook. His fluency in both engineering language and cultural context made his notes invaluable. Those annotations, some written in careful blue ink, became marginalia in hundreds of intelligence files. They were small, precise, and uncredited contributions that guided an entire generation of researchers. He rarely interacted directly with the paperclip recruits, but his observations about their working styles were noted by American officers. He cautioned that while the Germans possessed brilliant individual engineers, they struggled with collaborative efficiency. He urged the Americans to impose structure and accountability, principles that soon defined the research culture at Wright-Patterson and Edwards Air Force Base. In effect, Lerche helped translate not only technical knowledge, but the psychology of German engineering into a form that the American system could absorb. Meanwhile, the larger world was shifting rapidly. The Soviet Union's aggressive technological push, the first nuclear tests, the emergence of the MiG fighter line, made clear that air superiority would remain central to geopolitical power. The same lessons Lerche had helped the Americans internalize now guided the development of jet interceptors, long-range bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft, capable of operating at altitudes unimagined a decade earlier. As the 1950s began, Lerche's personal world remained confined. His identity as a defector was still sensitive. Public knowledge of German cooperation with the U.S. military was limited, and officials preferred to avoid attention that might complicate relations with Europe. He lived quietly near Dayton, in housing provided for foreign specialists under restricted movement conditions. He was given access to technical materials and a modest allowance, but not citizenship. Those who encountered him during this time described a man who carried himself with restrained discipline. He maintained the posture and habits of a test pilot, precise, punctual, and analytical. His days were spent reviewing technical papers, advising engineers, and occasionally visiting the airfield to observe new test flights. He rarely spoke of the past, but colleagues noted his quiet satisfaction when he saw new aircraft successfully complete trials. It was as though each successful flight validated his belief that knowledge, not ideology, defined progress. Over time, his circle of contacts narrowed. Many of the officers and engineers he had initially worked with were reassigned or retired. The younger generation, absorbed in supersonic research and the early space program, regarded him as a relic of another era, a link to the chaotic years of the 1940s when aviation was still governed by instinct and experimentation. Still, his presence carried symbolic weight. He was living proof that even amid war, the pursuit of understanding could bridge former enmities. As the decade advanced, the narrative of Operation Paperclip began to surface in journalistic and political debates. Stories of German scientists contributing to U.S. missiles and jets appeared sporadically in newspapers. Yet Lerche's name never appeared. His case had been too singular, his defection too unusual to fit neatly into that narrative. Unlike the scientists brought over by arrangement, he had arrived by his own decision, without permission or escort. His work had preceded the program and remained classified longer than most. Historians later concluded that his defection likely influenced how American intelligence evaluated the potential loyalty of other German specialists. His cooperative attitude proved that ideological conversion was possible, that professional expertise could override political allegiance when properly managed. Internal memos from Air Technical Intelligence referred to his case as a successful psychological model, a phrase that revealed the U.S. government's evolving approach to integrating former adversaries. By the mid-1950s, the jet age had matured. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, the B-47 Stratojet, and the experimental Bell X-1 embodied the principles Lerche had discussed in his early reports: streamlined airflow, stable high-speed control, and optimized engine endurance. He watched these advancements with quiet pride, aware that the data he had once provided about high-speed oscillation and compressibility had contributed to the knowledge base behind them. The echoes of his wartime test flights had become part of the foundation of modern aeronautics. During this period, Lerche occasionally corresponded with a few former German colleagues who had been relocated under Paperclip. Their letters, cautiously phrased and screened by censors, reflected a shared sense of displacement. They spoke of laboratories and flight fields, not politics. The tone was professional, devoid of nostalgia. In those exchanges, Lerche often emphasized the importance of scientific integrity and the moral duty of engineers to prevent the misuse of technology. His words hinted at an internal reconciliation with his past, a conviction that his defection had been not betrayal but transformation. His daily life remained simple. He lived alone, maintained his own records, and kept meticulous flight journals even though he no longer flew. He filled notebooks with aerodynamic equations, sketches of jet intake profiles, and reflections on aircraft performance. These writings, later discovered in storage, revealed a man who had never ceased to think like a test pilot. Every entry was an analysis, every observation a continuation of his lifelong dialogue with machines and flight. In the late 1950s, the United States entered the era of rocketry and space exploration. Many of the engineers who had followed Lerche's path into cooperation were now working on missiles and early space capsules. Though he was not directly involved, his reports from the 1940s were still cited in the archives of the Air Force's Aeronautical Research Laboratory. His observations on stress distribution and engine thrust efficiency were relevant even in projects that reached beyond Earth's atmosphere. As the decades passed, Lerche's anonymity deepened. The documents bearing his initials remained classified well into the 1970s. When they were finally reviewed for declassification, historians found detailed technical accounts but little biographical information. He had left no memoir, no public testimony, no claim of recognition. His life had been defined by discretion and by the quiet transfer of knowledge across one of history's deepest divides. Only fragments of his personal correspondence survived. In one letter, written to an American engineer shortly before his retirement, he reflected on his journey. He wrote that the greatest victory of his life had been not in battle, but in the rediscovery of trust. That former enemies had built machines together designed not for destruction, but for progress. It was a simple statement, but within it was the essence of his legacy. By the time of his death, little public record existed to mark his contribution. Yet his influence endured in the archives, in the design philosophies of aircraft that still bore the marks of the lessons he taught, and in the subtle transformation of military research culture that valued integration of knowledge over the segregation of ideology. In the years that followed, historians who studied post-war aviation traced recurring phrases and analytical methods in U.S. Air Force technical reports back to German traditions of test documentation. Among the earliest examples were those written by Lerche. His precise phrasing, short, factual, unembellished, became the standard for flight evaluation formats used for decades. The lineage of those reports was, in its own quiet way, a monument. Lerche's life represented one of the rare moments when defection became creation, when a single decision to cross enemy lines reshaped the technological future of the victors. In the grand narrative of World War II and its aftermath, his story remained a hidden thread, a reminder that even amid devastation, knowledge continued to move forward, carried by individuals who refused to let ideology define the limits of discovery. In the decades that followed Hans Werner Lerche's death, the details of his life remained largely hidden within the vaults of military archives. His reports, marked by reference codes and technical notations, were stored among thousands of wartime intelligence documents. Only a handful of researchers knew that the calm, concise handwriting belonged to the Luftwaffe test pilot, who had once crossed the front lines in the final winter of the war. His defection had been so unusual, his cooperation so quietly handled, that his story vanished from the public record for nearly half a century. It was not until the early 1980s that historians and aviation researchers began to uncover fragments of his legacy. As the U.S. government gradually declassified portions of its World War II intelligence files, the Air Technical Intelligence reports, once considered too sensitive for public release, became available to scholars. Buried among the data on captured aircraft were files written in English but bearing unmistakably German technical phrasing. Cross-referencing these documents with Luftwaffe records revealed a pattern that pointed to Lerche. The researchers found evaluations of the P-51, P-47, and P-38 written in 1945 with extraordinary insight into both German and Allied engineering practices. The author's familiarity with both systems suggested more than interrogation testimony. It reflected direct experience. Further investigation confirmed that Hans Werner Lerche had indeed conducted flight evaluations for the U.S. under restricted supervision. This discovery reframed a small but crucial chapter in the history of wartime intelligence and post-war aviation research. The documents demonstrated that Lerche's role extended beyond mere testing. His comparative analyses served as templates for the American technical debriefings of German scientists who arrived under Operation Paperclip. He had effectively laid the groundwork for the cross-pollination of engineering knowledge that would define early Cold War research. Many of the technical terms he introduced, particularly those related to airflow instability and high-altitude control response, remained in American aerospace terminology for decades. As historians traced his influence, they discovered that Lerche's data had quietly shaped early U.S. jet development. Reports written in 1946 and 1947 under anonymous attribution contained evaluations of jet engine stress cycles and airflow anomalies at transonic speeds. These findings corresponded precisely with problems American engineers were encountering in the P-80 and the prototype that would become the F-86 Sabre. His explanations of how German engineers managed similar challenges provided valuable direction during the U.S. transition to jet-powered flight. When aviation archivists pieced together the timeline of his collaboration, they found that Lerche had participated in at least 24 test flights at Wright Field, with detailed notes comparing captured Luftwaffe models to American production aircraft. These reports demonstrated a remarkable balance between precision and restraint. He never used speculative language. Each observation was supported by numerical data and aerodynamic reasoning. His writing reflected a pilot who thought like an engineer, someone who viewed machines not as weapons but as systems of logic. The rediscovery of Lerche's work coincided with a broader reevaluation of the post-war transfer of German science to the United States. While the narrative of Operation Paperclip often focused on rocket development and space exploration, Lerche's case offered a subtler perspective. He had not been recruited, he had defected. His cooperation had been motivated not by opportunity, but by conviction. He had chosen to contribute to a future he believed could transcend the collapse of his homeland. Academic papers written in the 1990s began to recognize his significance. Aviation historians cited him as one of the earliest examples of a German specialist whose expertise directly influenced Allied development before the war had even ended. His reports were compared to the British evaluations conducted at Farnborough, yet his stood out for their depth and balance. Unlike most wartime intelligence documents, his contained no propaganda tone, no attempt to exaggerate or conceal weaknesses. They were professional, measured, and entirely technical, a reflection of the pilot's character. As more documents surfaced, researchers reconstructed the timeline of his defection. Evidence suggested that Lerche had planned his crossing for months, waiting for a moment when he could reach American-held territory without arousing suspicion. His crash in December 1944 had been carefully staged. Intelligence analysts reviewing post-war records concluded that Lerche had likely been in contact with intermediaries aware of his intent, though no official correspondence confirming this survived. His plan had been executed at great personal risk, with no guarantee of safety or acceptance on the other side. The motivations behind his decision were still debated among historians. Some viewed it as a purely moral choice, a rejection of a regime he no longer believed in. Others saw it as pragmatic, a test pilot's recognition that Germany's defeat was inevitable and that survival lay in aligning with those who could continue the pursuit of aeronautical progress. Whatever his reasons, the decision placed him at the intersection of two eras, the dying world of the Luftwaffe and the emerging dominance of American air power. By the time his story became known, the world he had influenced had changed beyond recognition. Supersonic flight was routine, jet bombers had given way to stealth aircraft, and the skies he had once described in his reports were now traversed by machines capable of crossing continents in hours. Yet the principles he articulated, efficiency, reliability, and precision, remained fundamental to every aircraft design philosophy. Lerche's name began appearing in specialized aviation publications, often mentioned alongside other test pilots who had shaped aviation history. Writers described him as the invisible link between the Me-262 and the P-80, between wartime desperation and post-war innovation. His role symbolized how knowledge could migrate across battle lines, turning instruments of war into tools of advancement. In the 2000s, a collection of his surviving notes was donated to a German aviation museum by a private collector who had acquired them from a retired American engineer. Among the papers were detailed sketches of aircraft components, aerodynamic calculations, and personal reflections written in German. One note stood out: "In flight, there is no enemy, only gravity, drag, and the limits of design." That sentence encapsulated the philosophy that had defined his post-defection life. A belief that science existed above politics, that the pursuit of understanding could redeem even the ruins of war.